Hello and welcome to Kevin's Corner, where you can find real truth real quick. Ernest Hemingway, in his novel The Sun Also Rises, tells of a conversation in which one man asked another, "How did you go bankrupt?" And the answer is unforgettable. Gradually, then suddenly. And that answer explains far more than financial collapse. How do earthquakes happen? Pressure builds slowly beneath the Earth's surface until suddenly it is released with devastating force. Many addictions begin with a single decision, and then they grow gradually, almost unnoticed, until suddenly a person finds themselves imprisoned in a habit they cannot break. The decline of a nation is usually slow, almost imperceptible, until suddenly everyone realizes that it has fallen. Venezuela is a good example. In 1992, it was the third richest nation in the Western Hemisphere, fueled by enormous oil wealth. Its collapse unfolded gradually, but within less than 2 decades, millions were fleeing the country because of poverty and hunger and political oppression. This same principle applies spiritually. And one of the greatest dangers Christians face is not an immediate rejection of God, but a gradual drifting away from Him. We might adapt Hemingway's quote and ask, "How did you lose your faith?" And the answer could very well be, gradually, then suddenly. Charles Templeton was preaching alongside Billy Graham, speaking to crowds of more than 30,000 throughout Canada and the United States. But over time, doubts slowly accumulated in his heart and mind. Questions became skepticism, and skepticism eventually became unbelief. And he ultimately denied God and declared himself an agnostic in his book, Farewell to God. Yet, near the end of his life, there seemed to be a deep regret. Listen to what he told Lee Strobel.
As he neared the end of his life, battling Alzheimer's disease, Templeton granted a final, tearful interview. The journalist, Lee Strobel, himself a former atheist turned Christian apologist, asked him about Jesus. And in that moment, the hardened intellect, the rigorous skeptic, seemed to soften. Tears welled in Templeton's eyes as he spoke of the Nazarene. He was, Templeton whispered, his voice thick with emotion, the most marvelous man who ever lived.
Joshua Harris wrote the best-selling book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and later he became the senior pastor of Covenant Life Church, a megachurch in Gaithersburg, Maryland. And over the years, he also began to question his theology. He publicly renounced much of what he had written, and after years of gradual doubt, he announced that he had experienced a massive shift in his faith and was no longer a Christian. I believe many Christians can develop a false sense of security. And the thinking goes something like this: God is loving. My commitment doesn't really matter. No matter how I live, my place in God's kingdom is secure. Or perhaps Judas experienced something similar. I am one of Christ's chosen disciples. Of all people, Jesus selected me. He was entrusted with the money bag, the treasure of the disciples. There was a first time he helped himself to its contents, and then there was another, and then another. At first, perhaps he simply wondered why Jesus wasn't leading a political revolution against Rome, and those thoughts slowly turned into disappointment and then resentment, and finally and ultimately betrayal. A gradual buildup of greed, unbelief, and bitterness ended suddenly in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Judas betrayed the very Son of God with a kiss. King Solomon gradually compromised by marrying foreign wives, and over time, they turned his heart away from the Lord. King Saul repeatedly ignored God's commands until he found himself in open rebellion. Lot, he pitched his tent toward Sodom, and what began as proximity became familiarity and then acceptance, until suddenly he was living in the very city whose wickedness would bring God's judgment. Each of these people experienced a slow cooling of their relationship with God before they suddenly found themselves in spiritual ruin. The writer of Hebrews warns us, "Take care, brothers, lest there be any of you who are led away by an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God." The danger usually doesn't arrive all at once. Solomon reminds us that it is often the little foxes that spoil the vineyards. Small compromises quietly gnaw away at the roots before anyone notices the damage. Likewise, Proverbs warns that poverty comes through a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Both financial poverty and spiritual poverty usually arrive gradually. Jesus also warned that spiritual life can be choked by the cares and the riches and the pleasures of life. Our relationship with God must be continually nourished. We must breathe in His presence. We must fill our minds with His truth and pursue His holiness. Otherwise, the worries of this world slowly suffocate our faith. So what can we do? Well, Peter tells us to be sober-minded, to be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Jesus said, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation." Solomon wrote, "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life." And Paul urged his believers, his followers, continue steadfastly in prayer. And again, be watchful, stand firm in the faith. Remember this, no one wakes up one morning and suddenly abandons the faith. The drift usually begins with one neglected prayer, one neglected scripture, one compromise, one unchecked temptation, one step away from Christ. It happens gradually, then suddenly. If this message has encouraged or challenged you, please like, share, and subscribe to Kevin's Corner for more biblical teaching that is diligently sought, deliberately taught, and dauntlessly defended. Until next time, live bravely and courageously.